Hi there everyone. Alright, by the end of the series of video clips you're going to be watching, these are the list of things I would hope that you're able to explain. For example, you should be able to describe the general structure of the human nervous system. You should also be able to identify and explain the different parts of a typical neuron cell. In terms of the synapse, be able to state what the function of the synapse is. The relationship between the receptors, the central nervous system, and effectors is important. And here specifically, you should be able to state the functions and the relationship between the sensory neurons, the relay neurons, and the motor neurons. Alright, so let's get started. Hi there boys and girls. Today we're going to be looking at your nervous system. Alright, your nervous system is a very important system. It helps to monitor both the external and internal environment, and it helps to keep your body under homeostasis, something we already studied. Alright, what you see on the screen right now is a general outline of the human body, and within that, the skeletal system. The skeletal system plays a very important part in terms of protecting your nervous system. Up here, you see the skull. The skull is essentially where your brain sits in. Then running from your skull down to about here is your vertebral column. Alright, they're made up of vertebral discs, and they essentially contain your spinal cord. Alright, then at this region here's your pelvis, and these are the rest of your bones in your body. Up here you also see the ribs, which are important in protecting your main organs up in the thorax, which is your chest area. Alright, let's flip this dude around. Alright, as you can see, the skull is up here. From the base of the skull runs your vertebral column. Let's put in the nervous system to show you how they're connected. Alright, so these yellow things that you see running down here and from the sides here and along your arms and your legs as well are essentially your nerves. You can divide your nervous system into two main parts. Let me remove the skeletal system so we have a better view of the nervous system. So here what you see is your brain up here that was sitting in your skull, and running down here and ends about here, it's your spinal cord. And coming out at intervals along your spinal cord, a whole bunch of nerves. Now we divide the nervous system into the brain and the spinal cord to form what we call the central nervous system, or your CNS. So your CNS consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and all the rest of these nerves that you see running out, we call them the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. So essentially, I repeat, you can divide it into two main parts: the brain, the spinal cord, constituting the central nervous system. Essentially, you can see it's right in the center of your body, and the rest of the nerves that come out from it, we call it the peripheral nervous system. Let's get a closer look at your spinal cord and the nerves that come out of it. Okay, so here, as you can see, right, let me turn this around. You have your spinal cord running down, and you have nerves coming up from the front and from the back and the front. We call the front here the ventral root, the one at the back, the dorsal root. They connect here and then they run along here. Let me just put in the skeletal system. Alright, so you can see where the nerves are actually coming out from. Alright, okay, if you look, alright, just where the ribs are, just below the ribs, the nerves actually come out from there. Alright, and you can see the nerves actually run along the ribs, again essentially for protection. So the gap here is where the nerves come out. If I can get a bit closer, alright, let's see what we can see. Alright, you will notice there's actually a swelling here. This is known as the dorsal root ganglion. We'll study a bit more about it later, but just keep in mind that there's a dorsal root ganglion. Let me just remove the skeletal system once again. Alright, so here you see the dorsal root coming out, connected to the dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root comes out here. They come together here and they run as one spinal nerve. Then they split up here and run to different parts of the body. Let's go look at the brain. Okay, up here. Okay, we are looking from the underside of the brain. Can I get any closer? Alright, so you see your eyeballs here, and you have nerves running out. These are your optic nerves. You also have this pair here. These are your olfactory nerves. They're essentially the ones that are in your nose that help you in sensing scent. Alright, see if I can get any closer. That's right, let's look at this. Okay, do you see this little thing up here? Right at the base. Let me turn this around. Okay. Let's get up here. Oops, too high. Okay. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. See this little thing here at the base of this area of the brain? Well, that's your pituitary gland. If you remember, we studied the pituitary gland when we did homeostasis. That's right, okay? So this is the pituitary gland that you learned, which sits at the base of your hypothalamus, which is up here. Alright? Alright, so let's have a quick recap. Okay, your brain, your spinal cord constitute the central nervous system, running out at intervals along your spinal cord, and you also have nerves coming out from your brain as well. The ones coming out from your brain are called your cranial nerves, which we won't be studying much of. The ones that are coming out from your spinal cord are the ones we call spinal nerves. So this and this together form the central nervous system. All the rest of it forms the peripheral nervous system. Alright, next we're going to look at the cells that makes up the nervous system, called a neuron. And we will be looking at other parts of the nervous system and how it works. We're going to be looking at a typical cell found in the nervous system. It is called a neuron. Alright, just as most cells, the neuron has a nucleus, which you can see up here, and a cytoplasm around the nucleus. Collectively, this is known as the cell body. A neuron essentially takes impulses in, processes it, and passes it out. So information coming in comes in through these areas here. The fiber which receives information is known as a dendron. Alright, now the terminal parts of a dendron are referred to as dendrites. Basically, they are smaller branches of the dendron. Now once information comes into the dendron, it goes to the cell body, it will have to pass out. It passes out through this very long fiber called an axon. Alright, so an axon essentially is the fiber where information is passing out from the cell body. The axons generally have a layer of fat wrapped around it. Collectively, it is known as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is made up from cells called Schwann cells. So as you can see, the direction of movement of the nerve impulse is away from the cell body. Now the myelin sheath doesn't run continuously. There are gaps along the myelin sheath, and these gaps are known as the node of Ranvier. The node of Ranvier is important because it allows a nerve impulse to actually jump from one node to another, which essentially helps it to move faster. At the end of the axon, you have what is known as axon terminals, very similar to dendrites. Alright, so they will then pass the message or the impulse on to another cell, or possibly a muscle or a gland. So let's have a quick recap. A neuron has a cell body. The fiber that brings impulses into the cell body is known as a dendron. After being processed in the cell body, the impulse is sent out away from the cell body through an axon. Most axon will have a layer of fat wrapped around it called a myelin sheath, made from cells called Schwann cells. Sometimes you find gaps along the myelin sheath called a node of Ranvier. Nodes of Ranvier are important because it allows impulses to travel faster by jumping from one node to another. Finally, at the end of the axon, you have axon terminals. These little things here can be referred to as dendrites as well. They will connect to another cell possibly, or they can connect to a muscle, or they can connect to a gland, and they pass the impulse on. Now you look at a little video clip that shows you how the myelin sheath is produced by Schwann cells and how the nodes of Ranvier help the nerve impulse to travel faster compared to a neuron which doesn't have a myelin sheath.
Schwann cell forms a protective covering around the axon. Schwann cells start to develop in the embryo and continue to increase the wrapping around the axon through childhood. This development increases the thickness of the wrappings, which peaks in adolescence. This is why teenagers have such quick responses. The Schwann cell contains the typical cell organelles and cell membrane structure. However, notice as the Schwann cell surrounds the axon that the nucleus and other organelles are squeezed to the outside wrapping of the cell. This outer wrapping of the Schwann cell is called the neurolemma. The inner lining is made up of layers upon layers of cell membrane. This inner wrapping is called the myelin sheath. The thicker the myelin, in other words, the more layers of cell membrane making up the myelin, the more advantageous it is to the axon. One advantage is the regeneration of severed axons. Another advantage is an increase in the speed of the propagation of the action potential along the axon. The rest of this presentation will concentrate on the increased speed of action potentials down the length of the myelinated axon. Here is the neuron, and you can see the repeated Schwann cell membrane forming the myelin. Note that there is a small space between the Schwann cells where the axon is not covered by the neuroglial cell. These spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. From what you already know, action potentials occur at the axon hillock and continue to be repeated away from the cell body, much like dominoes falling one after another. Compare the unmyelinated axon with the myelinated axon. You can see that action potential reach the end of the myelinated axon more rapidly than the unmyelinated axon. The speed of the propagation is faster going from node to node than action potentials that develop adjacent to the previous action potential.
Now what you see in the picture here is essentially the ending of one axon and the starting of another dendron. The space between these two is known as a synapse. A synapse is essentially a junction between two neurons. It can also be a junction between axon and what is known as an effector, which would normally be a muscle or a gland. When a nerve impulse reaches the end of an axon, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters, which are essentially chemicals. The chemicals are then released and they will diffuse across the synapse to the other dendron, or possibly effectors such as muscle or gland, and the creation of a new impulse. In the case of another nerve, the impulse is created and it will travel through the neuron. But in the case of things like muscles, it will cause contraction of muscles or secretions from the gland. Now that we have looked at the overall nervous system, the central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. And we have also looked at what a neuron is made up of, the different parts of a neuron. And last but not least, we also looked at how neurons connect to each other through a synapse. Now let us revisit some of the different things that we learned and summarize it so we have a complete picture of how the nervous system essentially works. You have receptors, for example, in your skin. A receptor would respond to a stimulus and create an impulse. For example, the weather might be cold and an impulse is created to show that there's a drop in temperature. This impulse then travels through what is known as a sensory neuron. A sensory neuron essentially brings information from a receptor to the central nervous system. So this part here is part of the peripheral nervous system. Alright, the sensory neuron cell body is actually found here in what is known as a dorsal root ganglion. This is known as the dorsal root because it faces the back, the dorsal side. So when the sensory neuron comes in, it will travel into the spinal cord and it will synapse with another neuron. Neurons within the spinal cord and the brain are referred to as relay neurons. Why relay neurons? Because they essentially transmit data from one area to another. If you looked at the cross section of the spinal cord, you'll notice that there's a central area which is darker and an outer area which is lighter. The darker region is referred to as gray matter and the lighter region on the outside is referred to as white matter. It is gray matter because it appears darker when looking through, for example, MRI. It's gray in color because the cell bodies are located here and cell bodies tend to be more dense. Now the relay neuron will then take the impulse and transmit it up to the brain. So it will travel through the white matter. Why is the area whitish or light in color? Because it is essentially the axons that are running up, and as you learned earlier, axons are wrapped around by a myelin sheet, which is essentially fatty tissue, so it's less dense. The information will then travel up through the relay neuron to the brain. And again, if you look at a cross section of the brain, in the brain the white matter is actually on the inside and the gray matter is on the outside, again because the cell bodies of the neurons are actually on the outside rather than the inside in the brain. Alright, so here processing will take place. For example, the brain will decide, okay, it's as you've realized it's getting cold, you probably need to put on a sweater. So it needs to tell the muscles involved to pick up the sweater to put it on and such. So the information is then sent down to another relay neuron to the respective nerves, which will then control the muscles. And it will synapse to what is known now as a motor neuron. Essentially, a motor neuron is something that causes a movement or a certain reaction. For in this case, a muscle. So the motor neuron then runs out of the central nervous system through the ventral horn or the ventral root. Alright, then as the cell body is inside, there is no ganglion on the ventral root. It will then travel through a spinal nerve, split, and travel onto the effector, which is either a muscle or a gland, and cause a certain reaction. So let's repeat this again. Receptor picks up an impulse, sends it through the sensory neuron, which travels through the spinal nerve, and as it approaches the spinal cord, divides or splits into the dorsal root. The dorsal root ganglion is where the cell bodies are. It will synapse with a relay neuron. The relay neuron will send information to the brain processes information, sends information back down again to another relay neuron, which then synapses with a motor neuron, which comes out of the spinal cord through the ventral root, travels through a spinal nerve onto an effector, where it will cause a specific change. On this side, there's a slight difference. The receptor again picks up the information, sends through the sensory neuron, goes through the dorsal root. Here it synapses to a relay neuron, but instead of sending the information to the brain, the relay neuron directly synapses to another motor neuron. And again, the same thing happens in the sense that the information goes out through the ventral root and onto an effector. This is known as a reflex arc. We will learn more about this slightly later, but essentially it's for situations which can be considered dangerous and a quick action is required.